made it here this evening to see you, brothers and sisters, and I haven't been with you for a while. But even though it's going to be a short lecture, it will require you to think and to reflect and to contemplate. Some of the material is going to be easy and straightforward, and some of the material is going to be a little bit difficult, but it's going to be very relevant. Once in a while, it's good to see and think about some of the questions that we face. And rather than trying to answer those questions with very simple answers or with anecdotal answers, we look at it from the foundational level. We look at it from the root of it. And that means we have to think a little bit. Now, the question that I want to look at today is, do we need religion for spirituality? Okay. It's a very important question. I recently was looking up a research, and this research compared how people in America felt in 2017 versus how they felt in 2012. In 2012, for example, about 59% of people, according to this research, considered themselves to be religious. And only 18% of people considered themselves to be spiritual, but not religious. Okay? 5 years later, they conducted the same survey again, almost within the same standard or same population. And they found that 5 years later, 49% of people, if I'm not mistaken, considered themselves to be religious and spiritual. But in 2012, only 18 or 19% of people considered themselves to be spiritual but not religious. By 2017, the number increases to 28% or 29%. So the same number of people that no longer consider themselves to be religious do, however, consider themselves to be spiritual. If they don't think religion is important in their lives, they do definitely think that spirituality is something which is important in their lives. And more so, they're moving away from what we call organized religion, but they still want to maintain spirituality. So the question that we're faced with is, well, can you have spirituality without religion? Now, spirituality itself is something that's very, very important, you know. Nowadays, for example, even if you go to the hospitals, they have spiritual care practitioners. In fact, hospitals train and pay for spiritual care practitioners. If you go and ask Dr. Maulana Nasir Zaidi, some of you know him, he works at the hospitals 2 or 3 times a week. The doctors come up to him and say that with this particular patient, we've tried all medicine, okay, but we think that now he needs spiritual care. That's something that will help him with his condition at this time. Okay. Even when you go to counselors, and they're non-Muslim counselors, they will ask you to work with spirituality. I remember I was in Minnesota, and we had an open forum where we spoke about mental health. And one of the brothers there, he kind of opened up, and he said that I do have serious mental health struggles. And I go to a non-Muslim counselor. My non-Muslim counselor is insistent that I be in touch with my religion and I be in touch with my spirituality. In fact, my counselor will follow up with me and will ask me, have you said your prayers? Even though my counselor is not a Muslim, because she recognizes the power of spirituality and the power of prayer in my own growth and my own healing as well. So spirituality is something very, very important to us. Whether a person is religious or they're not religious, they recognize the importance of spirituality. The question we want to look at today is, can you have spirituality without religion? Okay? Now, to answer that question, we really have to look at 3 questions. Number 1, what is spirituality? And I find that even today in the Muslim community, the term spirituality is a very ambiguous term. Even we are not clear about what is spirituality. And we'll get to that today. Secondly, what is religion? And what does religion teach us? And then the third question that we can really look at is, do we need religion to attain that spirituality? Okay? Now, the question is far too vast for us to cover it today. And we won't be able to look at all aspects of the question today. But I do want to look at one aspect of the question. And that is, what is spirituality? Okay? It's such an ambiguous term that sometimes when I go to Muslim conferences and we're seated there as Muslims and scholars are there, and the conversation goes in this manner, where one person says that this is what spirituality means to me, and this is how I attain spirituality. Tell me, what does spirituality mean to you, and how do you attain spirituality? Okay? And that gets me thinking, that is it possible that Islam would not define spirituality for us? Is it possible that Islam would teach us how to attain spirituality? It would tell us that spirituality is important, but it wouldn't tell us what is spirituality. What is a profound experience of spirituality? And what's a very superficial experience of spirituality? And how can I make the distinction between the two? You also find that we live in a world where feelings and emotions have become very important. And our own feelings and our own emotions become very important. Even when we want to judge whether something is right or wrong, we look at how we feel about it, correct? We want to judge whether something is good or bad, we look at how we feel about it. And even when we talk about spirituality, we look at how we feel about it. So if I come to a gathering and I feel good, I feel connected to the universe, for example, I say to myself, wow, that's a spiritual moment. And if I come to a gathering and I don't feel so much, for example, I don't get a lot of emotions, tears don't flow from my eyes, I say to myself, now that wasn't a spiritual moment, right? If I wake up early in the morning for Fajr prayer, and for example, I don't feel a whole lot of emotion or desire to pray, I say, what kind of a prayer is that? But I'm not feeling it very spiritual, you know? Maybe I shouldn't be praying that prayer. But if I go to some place and for whatever reason I feel a rush or a gush of emotion, suddenly that becomes a very, very spiritual moment for me. So we associate a lot of what we consider to be spirituality with feelings and emotions. I was recently traveling to Chicago, and I was on the plane. I was preparing my notes for the conference in Chicago, and there was a screen in front of me there. And I was busy preparing my notes, so I didn't even put the headphones to listen to what was happening in the screen there. But I could see what they were showing on the screen, and they had closed captioning going on there. So I started to read the closed captioning. Looked interesting. They took the documentary or whatever it was into a farm. And the farm was a grape farm, was a vineyard. And they were growing grapes, and then they were turning the grapes into wine. Yeah? And there's a family that was doing that. And they had been doing that for many, many years, in generations. So they were talking to that family, and this person was interviewing the owner of the vineyard and asking them why making wine was important to him and why making wine was important to his family for generations. And this is what the person said, and this is what I read on the closed captioning. Said, well, for me, the act of drinking wine is a very spiritual act. Because it connects me to the earth through the grapes. I feel connected to my land. I feel connected to the earth. And because I feel that way, then that's a very spiritual moment for me. So now, is that spirituality? Okay. So that's where the discussion now is going to become a little bit of a deeper discussion. I need your attention for the next 5 to 7 minutes after we recite the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Okay. So in modern societies, spirituality is associated with feelings and emotions. What about in Islam? In Islam, spirituality is not feeling. In Islam, spirituality is seeing. In Islam, spirituality is seeing the haqq, seeing the truth. Okay. Let's start very slowly. A human being has 3 dimensions to him. The first dimension is his body. And his body has the ability to see. And the body sees through the eyes. And these eyes, when they see forms, they see shapes, they see color, they see size. And the mind interprets that. The second dimension to a human being is his mind. And his mind also has the ability to see. It sees ideas. It sees concepts. It sees ideologies. Okay? You know, sometimes when you're struggling with an equation or you're struggling with understanding an idea and you really put a lot of time into it and finally you have this eureka moment where you get it, what do you say to yourself? You say, I can finally see it. I get it. I perceive it. Okay? The mind has also an ability to see, but it sees in accordance to its own ability. Okay? The third dimension to the human being is his heart. And the way the body can see and the way the mind can see, the heart is also able to see. The heart experiences certain realities. The heart believes in those realities. The heart with certainty accepts and submits to those realities. The heart realizes those realities. Okay? You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He wants to talk about certain people in the Quran, He says, إِنَّهُ لَا تَعْمَى الْأَبْصَارِ. You know, when we say these people are blind, it is not their eyes which are blind. وَلَكِنْ تَعْمَى الْقُلُوبُ الَّتِي فِي الصُّدُورِ. Rather, it is their hearts which are in their chests that have become blind. Okay? So the Quran clearly says that the heart has the ability to see, and the heart has the ability to become blind. Now, what's very interesting is you've got a whole set of verses in the Quran that are a little bit difficult to interpret. Okay? Let's start with some of them, and let's see what interpretation we can give to them. Okay? Allah says in the Quran, وُجُوهٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ نَاظِرَةٌ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهَا نَاظِرَةٌ. Okay? On the Day of Judgment, certain faces are going to be what? They are going to be fresh, and they will be looking at what? They will be looking at their Lord, at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are a number of verses that talk about seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Interestingly, there are a number of verses that talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala coming on the Day of Judgment. وَجَاءَ رَبُّكَ وَالْمَلَكُ صَفًّا صَفًّا. On the Day of Judgment, when your Lord and the angels come in rows. Okay? In fact, the Quran even talks about meeting God on the Day of Judgment. Right? And it's there in the Quran, where Allah says that the one who has hope to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَلْيَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا, then he should perform righteous deeds. Okay. How do you interpret these verses? Okay. The first interpretation is the interpretation of our brothers from the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, especially those who are considered to be Ahlul Hadith. And they say that we do not understand completely these verses of the Quran. The intellect is not completely able to fathom and understand them. But if that's what the Quran says, then that's what the Quran says. And they do believe on the Day of Judgment we will be able to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are even ahadith in Al-Bukhari and others where it describes how we will be able to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the Day of Judgment. It even goes further to say, for example, that on the Day of Judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put His leg into Jahannam, and then He'll ask Jahannam, would you like more? And Jahannam will say, qat, qat, like it's enough, it's enough. These ahadith are there. We say that's not possible. If something is not logically possible in this world, it's not logically possible anywhere else. 1 plus 1 is not going to equal 3 anywhere in the dunya. 1 plus 1 is not going to equal 3 anywhere in the akhirah. If something is logically impossible, it simply does not happen. If it is logically impossible for these eyes to see God, then even on the day of judgment, these eyes are not going to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why would require us to go into a whole discussion? It's a very straightforward discussion, but I don't want to take time with that. Okay. The second interpretation says, these verses are metaphorical verses. We shouldn't take these verses to be literal. When the Quran talks about seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it means on the day of judgment we're going to see the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're going to see the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're going to see the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or some people are going to see the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Metaphorically. The third interpretation, very interesting. It says, what if we take it literally? But we don't talk about seeing with the eyes. Because a human being has 3 faculties of sight. The eyes are able to see, and the mind is able to see ideas, and the heart is able to experience and see realities. I've shared with you before, I know sometimes it's very difficult for us to understand what's the difference when my mind sees something and when my heart sees something. Isn't it the same, right? After all, it's seeing a reality, it's accepting a reality. So you must have noticed in your life that not everything that you know, you believe in as well, right? There are certain things which your mind can see, but your heart is not yet accepting of it, right? If I were to ask many of you, that can a dead person do anything, what would you say? A dead person cannot do anything. A dead person cannot even protect itself. A dead person needs you to pick it up and carry it and put it into a grave, otherwise it remains outside the grave. So I ask you again, can a dead person do anything? And you will say, absolutely not. You say, very well. Next question for you, and maybe we've talked about this before. If I were to ask how many of you are willing to lie down next to a dead body in the ghusl room in Az-Zahra for 1 whole night, and I turn off the lights? Any volunteers? Say, why not? But what can a dead person do to you? What can a dead body do to you? Do you not know that a dead body cannot do anything? You say, I know. But in my heart, I still don't. That's the difference. When the mind sees something, and when the heart sees something. The mind understands, but the heart has conviction, the heart believes, the heart submits, the heart realizes. No, the heart experiences that truth, right? So now, coming back to that verse where it says, you're going to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What if we said that it's not the eyes that are going to see God, it's not the mind that will see God, but it is the heart that's going to experience the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like never before, where everybody will be certain. I ask you certain questions just to make you think. We say in the Quran, Maliki Yawmiddin. Maliki Yawmiddin means what? You recite it every day in your salat, you say it, in every salat at least 2 times. Throughout the day you will say it at least, 10 times, correct? What does Maliki Yawmiddin mean? It means that master of the day of judgment. Because the reality is that God is the master of not just the day of judgment. God is the master of every day. He's the master of today, and the master of yesterday, and the master of tomorrow. So my question to you now is that if God is the master of every day, then how come in the Quran Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, master of the day of judgment. Why? That's where you come to realize that today, tomorrow, and the day after, my heart may not realize that God is the master, but on the day of judgment, every heart will realize there is no master on this day except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Imam Ali was asked, can you see God? It's a very famous narration from the first Imam. He was asked, can you see God? And he said, do you think I worship a God that I cannot see? Right? Now, think about that. Somebody asked him about seeing God. He responds by saying, do you think I worship a God that I cannot see? What does that mean? That means the reason why we worship is to have an experience of God, is to feel the presence of God, right? Then the Imam explained to him, and the Imam said to him, surely it is not. God cannot be seen by these eyes, but He is seen by the heart with the haqiqah, with the reality of Iman. Okay? So let's come back to our conversation. In our conversation we said that today people may define spirituality as feeling or sensing or connecting or having an emotion. In Islam, spirituality occurs the moment when the heart sees a truth. When the heart sees a truth about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's a spiritual moment. Okay, so what difference does it make? And we're going to end with that. What difference does it make if I define spirituality as a feeling versus defining spirituality as a moment of seeing a truth? Let me share with you 2 or 3 very practical differences. Difference number 1 is that sometimes you could be having a moment of spirituality and you're not feeling anything. And sometimes you could be feeling a lot and you're not having a moment of spirituality. It all depends on whether you can see a truth or you cannot see a truth. And let me share some examples with you. I think these are very important examples. Because sometimes our mu'mineen, when they come for Thursday night programs, they come for Jum'ah, they come for Salatul Jama'ah, they come to Friday night programs. And you know, we live in this world of instant gratification. So when we come for the program, we have great expectations that when I enter the masjid, when I enter the Husayniyah, you know, I'll see angels, I'll have a moment of euphoria, the lights will turn on, you know, everything will look very, very spiritual. And I come in here, and then I have to struggle with some of the mu'mineen, struggle about getting some refreshments towards the end, you know. And you walk out and you say, well, what was that all about? Right? I came here to experience a very spiritual moment, and I ended up pushing and shoving and whatever it was. Right? Well, is it only spiritual when you feel good about it? And is it not spiritual when you don't feel good about it? Is it all about feelings? Listen to this hadith. You know, in this hadith we're told that in the middle of the night, and I've shared this hadith with some of you, sometimes a servant of God wakes up and he's very tired and he's very exhausted, and he stands up for the night prayer. And as he's praying, he's starting to doze off as well because he's tired. And at some point when he's standing in prayer, his chin touches his chest. It goes like this. And that means he's now sleeping almost. And I and you, if we were to look at that person, what we would say? We would say, you know, tonight he didn't have tawfiq. Tonight he did not experience spirituality. What kind of a prayer is this where this person falls asleep in the prayer? In the hadith we're told, God turns to His angels and says, you see that servant over there, that one that's fallen asleep? Yeah, that servant is my servant. You know the way where a parent sometimes talks about their children, when their children go up on the stage to get an award and the parent says to other parents, that particular child, that's my child. You look at that child, in the same way God turns to this servant and says, that servant is my servant. Now why does God see it differently? God sees it differently because this servant, even though he's dozing off and he's struggling in his prayer, in his heart he's come to see a reality. What reality does he see? He sees, God, my master has commanded me to rise in the night. I realize and I see that I am his servant and his slave. I must rise up in the night. Whether I feel like it, I don't feel like it. I enjoy it, I don't enjoy it. But the reality is my master wants me at this time. As a servant of his, I must be present. That's a moment of spirituality. Sometimes at school you have moments of spirituality. You just don't realize it. And those moments of spirituality build you. You realize it in the hereafter. You know, sometimes there's chaos happening at school. Everybody's doing their own thing. You haven't had a good day either. Your salat not on time. And there's an opportunity to do something haram, to look at something haram, to listen to something haram, to wear clothes in a way that's not appropriate. And you could look and you look down. And you could listen and you closed your ears. That moment, when you look down, is probably the most spiritual moment of your day. You just don't realize it. You know, the Prophet of Allah, Hadrat Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he says in a hadith to Imam Ali that the most difficult thing that God has made upon his servant is the dhikr of Allah. The dhikr of Allah is very difficult. Remembering God is very difficult. Then the Prophet says, but I don't mean subhanallahi, walhamdulillahi, wa la ilaha illallahu, wallahu akbar, even though that is a part of dhikr. Yeah, that's a part of dhikr. But I don't mean that dhikr. The real dhikr is عندما أحل وحرم, is when a person recognizes something is halal so he can do it, and something is haram so he stays away from it. That is true dhikr. Right? You know, when you realize that God is watching over me, my eyes are a blessing from God, my ears are a blessing from God, I have a duty to use my eyes and my ears the way it would please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the realization is so deep that you act according to that realization. It's so deep that you make a decision according to that realization. It's so deep you go against everybody else around you because you've realized something. That's a moment of spirituality. Because you see the truth, you experience it, you recognize it, even if you don't feel the greatest about it. Because spirituality is not feeling. Yes, it has strong feelings associated with it. But spirituality is a moment when the heart sees a reality. The second point about spirituality is that this kind of spirituality takes time to develop. It doesn't come overnight. It does not come from one program. It doesn't come from listening to one lecture. It doesn't come from reciting one dua. It's a profound level of experience. Right? If we define spirituality as seeing, spirituality as feeling and emotions, that spirituality is very easy to create. Sometimes some of the mu'mineen, they listen to some music and they say that was very spiritual music. You know? Or they listen to a particular type of music and they say, you know, Maulana, I feel very spiritual when I listen to that music. It puts me in the right set, mindset. It gives me the good feeling about being connected. When I say, what kind of spirituality is that? I say, turn off the music. Do you feel a sense of spirituality now? No. You don't. Right? I say, stop looking at what you were looking at, for example. Do you still feel a sense of spirituality? You don't. Spirituality should be something that stays with you. It should be something you wake up with. It should be something that you go to sleep with. It should be something that even when you go into a crowd, you've got it with you. It should be something that even when you're tired, you've got it with you. You know, Imam al-Hussein, on the day of Ashura, the narrator says, Abu Mikhnaf, one of the earliest narrations of the tragedy of Karbala, he says, by God, he was narrating from somebody. The person whom he was narrating from says, by God, I never saw a man surrounded by his enemies, but his face looking as bright as the face of Al-Hussein. With every passing hardship and difficulty, his face became brighter and brighter. That's spirituality. Not a spirituality where you press a button and it turns on and you press another button and it turns off. Now that's spirituality when you see reality, not just when you feel it. I'll end with the last one. There are many differences, but the last one is, in Islam, spirituality is not just about seeing anything. In Islam, spirituality is about seeing the truth. Seeing something about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Realizing it in the depth of your heart. It's not just this ambiguous definition where you say, I feel one with the universe, I feel connected with the universe. No, I've understood something. My heart has come to believe in it. My heart is experiencing it. The experience is very, very strong. You know how strong the experience can become? I think many of us don't sometimes experience how strong it can become. It's very difficult to even describe it. There are certain things you can't describe for anybody. You just have got to experience it for yourself. Like even if I came to you and I say to you, let's say a person had never seen a flower in their lives. They'd never touched it, they'd never smelt it, they'd never seen it. And you had to describe it for them, what would you do? You'd say, well, it's soft, and it's fragrant, and it's beautiful, and it's very, very nice to hold. And after you get frustrated and you get tired, you'll say to that person, you know what? I think the best thing for you is to do what? Just see it for yourself, right? That's the only way to experience it. When you talk about spirituality as seeing and experiencing from the heart, we can describe it, but really you will not appreciate it. But the first Imam in the dua of Kumail, look at what he says. He says, فَهَبْنِي يَا إِلَهِ صَبَرْتُ عَلَى حَرِّ نَارِكَ فَكَيْفَ أَصْبِرُ عَنِ النَّظَرِ إِلَى كَرَامَتِكَ كَيْفَ أَصْبِرُ عَلَى فِرَاقِكَ. My Lord, maybe I can be patient in being in the fire of hell, but how can I be patient at being separated from you, at not being able to see your generosity? That feeling of spirituality is far deeper than what many of us will have experienced, right? But that kind of spirituality is seeing the truth, okay? Not just getting in touch with anything. And I'll end with this. The late Sheikh Murtaza Bachoo, even when he talks about crying for Imam al-Hussein, there is a spiritual crying for Imam al-Hussein, and there is an emotional crying for Imam al-Hussein. He says you should have a spiritual crying for Imam al-Hussein, not just an emotional crying for Imam al-Hussein. He puts it this way. He says that when you're crying for Abu Abdullah, and even for a moment, your spirit, it soars and comes in harmony with the spirit of Imam al-Hussein. For a moment, you see a truth. You see one of his messages. You see his character. You see his personality. You see what he was trying to promote. He says, even for one moment, if you see that reality, and then a tear flows from your eyes, even if it is the size of the wing of a fly, then you have indeed achieved a great station. But if these tears are just pushed out of you, they're just butchered out of you, they're just brought out of you for any reason. Sometimes we cry because something happened to me that day, and I'm feeling sorry for myself, but then I attach it to Imam al-Hussein. Sometimes I cry because of a cultural idea. Something is important in my culture, and somehow I attach it to Imam al-Hussein. And I say, well, in my culture it would be pitiful if somebody felt this way. Oh, Imam al-Hussein also. Oh. Well, those tears are valuable. I'm not saying they're not valuable. Those tears bring us closer. But those are not very spiritual tears. Because spiritual tears are tears which flow when your heart comes in touch with what? With haqq, with the truth, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So next time somebody tells you that spirituality is an ambiguous term and we can define spirituality the way we want to define spirituality, tell them no. In the Quran and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, spirituality has a very clear definition. The definition of spirituality is that moment when the heart comes to experience a truth, whether it is attached with an emotion or it's not attached with an emotion. Now, if that's been answered, then the next question is, why do we need organized religion to experience that spirituality? Inshallah, that shall be for another day. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.